The deadline no one could extend. Time did not run out loudly. It slipped away quietly, 1 hour at a time, until the White House realized the deadline had arrived with no room left to maneuver. There would be no extensions, no delays, no second chances. Whatever happened next would happen now. Deadlines shape power in ways speeches never can. Inside the White House, they transform abstract risks into immediate consequences. They force leaders to act not when they feel ready, but when the clock demands it. And on this day, the clock was unforgiving. Every option still on the table came at a cost, but doing nothing had become the most dangerous choice of all. The deadline emerged from a process that had once seemed manageable. Early briefings framed it as flexible, a pressure point that could be negotiated or pushed back through diplomacy. Advisors believed time was an ally, but behind the scenes, conditions shifted. External actors hardened their positions. Signals once interpreted as leverage became warnings, and the margin for adjustment quietly disappeared. As the president entered the briefing room that morning, the atmosphere felt different. Not frantic, not chaotic, just heavy. Advisors spoke carefully, aware that language now mattered as much as policy. Updates confirmed what many had feared, but few had admitted aloud. The deadline was no longer theoretical. It was fixed, immovable, and closing fast. The most unsettling realization came when the team recognized what the deadline truly represented. It wasn't just a date on a calendar. It was a line between influence and irrelevance. If the White House acted before it passed, outcomes could still be shaped. If it didn't, decisions would be made elsewhere, beyond American control. Plans were reviewed again, stripped of optimism. Assumptions were challenged. Scenarios once dismissed as unlikely were now central to the discussion. The familiar rhythm of deliberation gave way to something sharper. Urgency without panic. Pressure without spectacle. And as the final hours approached, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was not a crisis that could be managed through gradual steps or symbolic gestures. The deadline demanded a decision that would define not only the response, but the credibility of the presidency itself. The question was no longer what the White House preferred to do. It was what it was willing to accept before time ran out. As the countdown continued, the White House shifted into a different mode of thinking. There was no longer space for theoretical debate or carefully balanced language. Each remaining option was evaluated not for perfection, but for survivability. What could still hold if the deadline passed? What would collapse immediately? Advisors gathered in smaller clusters, running parallel calculations, legal implications, strategic fallout, international response. Each assessment returned the same conclusion, in different words. Delay was no longer neutral. Delay had become a decision in itself, and a dangerous one. The deadline had stripped away the illusion of control. What made the moment so volatile was the absence of a clean solution. Every path forward triggered a chain reaction. Acting too forcefully risked escalation that could not be contained. Acting too cautiously risked signaling weakness at the exact moment strength was expected. And waiting, even briefly, risked losing the ability to shape events at all. The president listened as each scenario was presented, not interrupting, not reacting. This was familiar territory, pressure without clarity. But the difference now was finality. There would be no opportunity to revise the choice once the deadline passed. No quiet adjustment, no second briefing to soften the outcome. As minutes turned into hours, the deadline stopped feeling abstract. It became physical. Phones rang more frequently. Updates arrived faster. The room felt smaller. Advisors who normally spoke with certainty now framed their arguments carefully, acknowledging unknowns rather than dismissing them. One advisor finally voiced what others were thinking. The administration had misjudged how quickly the window would close. What began as a strategic timeline had turned into a fixed barrier. The acknowledgement did not place blame. It clarified reality, and that clarity changed the tone of the room. The president asked for one final review, not preferred outcomes, but of consequences. What would the nation face tomorrow under each scenario? What could still be managed? What could not be undone? The answers were stark, unfiltered, and deeply unsettling. The deadline was no longer approaching. It was here, and with it came the moment when leadership could no longer rely on preparation, persuasion, or process. Only decision remained. The clock did not stop. It never does. And as the final window narrowed to its edge, the White House prepared to act. Not because the choice was clear, but because time had removed every other option. The conflict reached its peak when the implications of action and inaction finally converged. Advisors were no longer debating strategy. They were confronting responsibility. The deadline had compressed weeks of uncertainty into a single, irreversible moment, forcing every assumption into the open. One faction argued that acting before the deadline would preserve leverage, even if it provoked backlash. They warned that missing the window would signal hesitation at a moment when resolve was being tested. Another faction countered that rushing a decision under artificial pressure could lock the country into consequences far more damaging than waiting. Both positions were grounded in logic. Both carried real risk, and neither offered protection from criticism. The tension in the room sharpened as new intelligence arrived, confirming that external actors were already preparing for the deadline's expiration. Contingency plans were being activated elsewhere. Decisions were being made without American input. The realization hit hard. The deadline was not just a constraint. It was a transfer of agency. Once it passed, control would move decisively away from the White House. The president recognized the turning point immediately. This was no longer about choosing the best option. It was about choosing the least irreversible outcome. That distinction changed everything. Advisors recalculated their positions, not to win the argument, but to minimize damage. Voices remained measured, but urgency pressed through every sentence. Careers, alliances, and credibility sat beneath the surface of each recommendation. The Oval Office had become a place where power confronted its own limits. The deadline had exposed a truth rarely acknowledged at this level. Sometimes leadership means acting without confidence, guided only by responsibility. The president asked one final question, cutting through the remaining debate. What happens if we do nothing? The answer arrived quickly and without hesitation. The consequences would not be delayed. They would begin immediately, unfolding beyond reach. The cost of restraint had surpassed the cost of action. Silence followed, not uncertainty, but recognition. The conflict had resolved itself not through agreement, but through inevitability. The deadline had done what no argument could. It had forced clarity by removing alternatives. The decision now waited not for consensus, but for resolve. And in that moment, the White House stood at the edge of time itself, preparing to act before the clock erased the last remaining choice. The decision was executed with precision, not drama. Orders were issued quietly. Channels were activated. The machinery of the White House moved with purpose, shaped by the understanding that time had dictated the moment, even if it had not defined the choice. The deadline passed without ceremony. No alarm sounded. No visible marker announced a shift. But inside the White House, everything changed. The administration had acted before control slipped away, accepting the consequences that came with that choice rather than surrendering agency to the clock. Reactions followed quickly. Some were immediate, others unfolded more slowly, revealing impacts that no briefing could have fully predicted. The president absorbed them all with the same measured focus that had defined the hours before the deadline. This was not about validation. It was about responsibility. Criticism arrived alongside support, as it always does. Some argued the administration had moved too soon. Others insisted it had waited too long. But beneath the noise, one truth remained. The decision had been made when delay would have carried greater risk than action. Leadership had asserted itself not through certainty, but through timing. In the days that followed, the White House adjusted. Plans evolved. Communications shifted. Allies recalibrated their expectations. The crisis did not vanish, but it moved into a different phase, one shaped by choice rather than paralysis. Looking back, the deadline would later be remembered not for the exact hour it passed, but for what it revealed about power under pressure. Deadlines do not care about preparation or preference. They expose what leaders are willing to accept when time removes comfort. Some decisions are judged by their outcomes. Others are judged by the moment they are made. This one would be studied for both, because when the deadline arrived, The White House did not wait for permission, reassurance, or perfect clarity. It acted. And in doing so, it demonstrated a quiet truth about leadership at its highest level. When time can no longer be extended, responsibility cannot be deferred. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. The